Word. That's so we can put it on YouTube. Okay, so we'll get into this. Hi, my name's Caitlin. I'm the events coordinator at Square Books in Oxford, Mississippi. We're so glad that everyone is here this evening to celebrate the US debut of Rainbow Milk by Paul Mendez. Okay, sorry about that. And he is joined in conversation with Maaza Mengiste, but before I hand it off to them, I wanted to do a little bit of Square Books housekeeping. And I'm sorry, y'all just give me one moment. There we go. Okay, sorry about that. Square Books housekeeping. First of all, if you're an Oxford resident, we have an election today. Polls close at 7. Make sure you do that. Now, and then later this week, Thursday, June 10th at 5:30 p.m., we have Kiese Lehman in conversation with Nafisa Thompson Spires for the triumphant reissue of Kiese's novel, Long Division. That's 5:30 this Thursday, June 10th. Monday, June 14th at 5:30, we'll be hosting Rivka Galkin in conversation with Alexandra Kleeman for Rivka's new novel, Everyone Knows Your Mother is a Witch, spellbinding historical fiction, not your grandmother's historical fiction. Really excited about it. 5:30 next Monday. Then Tuesday, June 15th at 6 p.m., we are tiptoeing back to in-person events. It'll be a hybrid event for Curtis Wilkie in his latest book, When Evil Lived in Laurel, The White Knights and the Murder of Vernon Dahmer. It's an inside story of an FBI informant who helped to bring down the KKK organization responsible for a brutal civil rights era killing in Laurel, Mississippi in 1966. If you would like to attend in person, keep in mind there is limited occupancy, socially distant seating, and masks will be required. You can also log on Zoom or tune in on Facebook Live. Finally, last one, then we'll get to the good stuff. Wednesday, June 16th at 5:30 Central Time on Zoom, we'll have Chris Offutt in conversation with Patton Oswalt for Chris's latest novel, The Killing Hills. It just got a fabulous review in Publishers Weekly. They call it a brooding and bloody country noir. Again, that's Wednesday, June 16th. Okay, so, but on to the good stuff. So we are here to talk about Paul and Maaza and Rainbow Milk. So a little bit more about them. Paul Mendez was born and raised in the Black Country. He now lives in London and is studying for an MA in Black British Writing at Goldsmiths, University of London. He has been a performing member of 2 theater companies and worked as a voice actor, appearing on audiobooks by Andrea Levy, Paul Theroux, and Ben Okri. Most recently recording Ian Wright's A Life in Football for Hachette Audio. As a writer, he has contributed to the Times Literary Supplement and the Brixton Review of Books. Rainbow Milk is his debut novel. And Maaza Mengiste, I'm sorry, Maaza. She is the author of The Shadow King, shortlisted for the 2020 Booker Prize and the recipient of the American Academy of Arts and Letters Award in Literature, as well as LA Times Book Prize finalist. It was named a Best Book of 2019 by the New York Times, NPR, Elle, and other publications. Beneath the Lion's Gaze, her debut, was selected by The Guardian as one of the 10 best contemporary African books. Phew. Very accomplished, both of y'all. I'm so glad y'all could join us. Y'all, please feel free to submit questions in the Q&A function, and I will come back at the end and moderate those. But I think you've heard enough of me, and I'm going to pass it off to y'all. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Oh my God, Paul, it is such a pleasure to talk to you.
It's so nice.
I have been
so
waiting.
Nice
I have been waiting for this book release in the US for, I think, a year now since you and I crossed paths online. I have the British version that you so kindly signed for me.
Don't worry, guys. I've got the US version as well.
Right.
I have the US version as well, but I'm probably going to read from this version because I know where everything is.
Yeah, you get used to one, I think.
Exactly.
And I remember reading it immediately, and just being struck by the beauty and the power of the story, the difficult subjects that you tackle. And when I say difficult, I'm really thinking of things like class and religion, not, these things that seem to hold Jesse and seem to hold Norman and generations of Black men in their place. And, this is a story in many ways about leaving. In one form or another, there are different migrations that are happening over the course of this book. But I think one of the central things here is the exploration of masculinity and Blackness, maybe Britishness as well, and how that connects to class and religion. And these larger questions, I think we often all ask ourselves at one point in our lives. And I wondered about the questions, or maybe even the memories, that led you to sitting down to write this book in the first place.
Thank you. Well, I wanted to, in the first instance, keep track of the changes that were happening in my life and to me mentally, to me emotionally.
Oh dear, have we lost Paul?
I think so.
No,
Let's see if he comes back.
Yeah. Oh well, Tinder hooks. I'm going to shoot him a quick email, tell him to come on in if that's what he's worried about.
Okay.
In the meantime, Maaza, so we, I know this is like kind of strange to do this without Paul, but before we kind of went live, we kind of talked about his use of language and dialect. So I wonder if maybe you wanted to talk about kind of the way that, like how that, like, let me try again. The ways that he's doing it and how that kind of, struck you as a reader and as a writer.
Yeah, I think one of the really wonderful things that Paul does here is that he inhabits characters through language, through voice. Norman, who is the character that shows up first here, who has come from Jamaica to settle in the UK. The language that Paul uses here is Jamaican patois. And there is a rhythm and a beauty in this that's really hard to resist. And while I think that language separates Norman initially from the other Brits, white Brits, that he's around, Paul also does this thing by allowing some of Norman's white co-workers, these are all working class people, factory workers and so on, you hear their voices too. And you see something different happening in English with that as well. And it's a wonderful, subtle, and maybe not so subtle work that Paul is doing in talking about the way that language can denote class, but in some ways can help us recognize the many ways that we are similar to each other. And I hope he comes back, because I would love to hear him talk about this.
I figured out what happened. I think Zoom just had kind of a crazy hiccup. So I just resent him his panelist invitation. So he should be back shortly.
Okay.
Okay. I'm sorry.
That's okay. What another thing that I will say is that before we got online, Paul and I were talking about how his book was released just as we all went into lockdown. So this book has had its entire publication life online. And so I want to hear him talk more about what that's been like, to have these conversations Oh, so he says he's here, but he just can't see himself.
Huh. All right. I wonder
It might
Paul,
be.
can you raise your hand as an attendee? I think I see you. Okay. Hi, Paul. Wait, where'd you go? Oh, man. Find a way or make one. Gonna promote you to panelist. Okay, which I think, there he is.
Yay.
Really? We did it. This has been very eventful. Welcome back, Paul.
Welcome
I do not know
back.
what happened in a whole year of Zooming. That has never happened.
All good. Totally
What was
fine.
that?
I
Love
have
what?
no idea. I'm going to say Mercury in retrograde. That's what happened. But,
Wow.
but I'm
You
glad
made
you're
it back. It's all good.
Yeah, we were the question that I was asking you
Yeah.
was about what were some of the memories or questions that led you to this book?
Well, I was starting to say that Rainbow Milk started life as a de facto memoir. So I'd been sort of keeping journals for years and years. I grew up as a Jehovah's Witness in the West Midlands, so the sort of industrial area outside the UK's second city. And was absolutely sort of invested in that. That was my entire sort of belief system. But I was disfellowshipped like Jesse, so expelled from that community, but for different reasons. And eventually moved to London and came out and explored my sexuality through sex work. But there's a big sort of change in your life and in your mentality, in your sort of in your entire sort of emotional apparatus, to go from someone who is completely sort of spiritual and invested in this kind of, paradise earth kind of future, to someone who has not just gone to the other side, as the witnesses have it in their sort of binary sense of everything, but become a sex worker. That was a real kind of huge change that happened over the course of only a very short time, just a few years. And for a while, I sort of got by just on bravado, really, but there were times when things got a little bit slippery. And I was just lucky that I was encouraged to write from quite an early age. I think writing is something, maybe it's different now in the age of social media and WhatsApp and text messages. I think everyone writes now. Everyone has their language and their way of communicating through words. But back then, sort of early 2000s, perhaps it was slightly different. Perhaps it's not something that people did often, certainly in terms of buying a journal and sort of taking pen to paper and writing every morning about how you feel, about what your mental health is doing, etc. And I really felt like I needed to sort of just keep in touch with myself, because I felt like I was on a downward spiral. And because I had no sort of emotional support, no support network around me, it was just very important that I at least had myself to speak to. So I gathered a lot of material over the years just in terms of that, really. And so as I got older, it just sort of struck me that there weren't stories like that being told, that literature didn't really sort of make space for voices like that, certainly not intersectional voices from young Black queer men perhaps from religious backgrounds, perhaps third generation immigrants. Nobody cares about third generation immigrants. People care about immigrants, but once you get to the third generation, it's like, well, you should have acclimatized to your home environment now, so you didn't even need to worry about anything. But that's not the case. You have your own set of identity issues that are different from your parents, that are different from your grandparents, and so that history is alive through me, and it was something that I began to be more and more aware of, with things like Black Lives Matter happening. It's not just an education for white people, Black Lives Matter. It's about Black people looking to themselves too and thinking, oh, well, I haven't sort of been taught any Black history. Am I now supposed to sort of go and find stuff out for myself that I wasn't told? There are so many issues around that. So for me, it became about establishing my own future and establishing what I wanted to think about, what I wanted to represent, but also looking back at the previous generations and rehabilitating them because they didn't have the opportunities to tell their stories. So yeah, Rainbow Milk became a personal project, but also one about history.
It's interesting that you mentioned this, this idea of looking into the past and rehabilitating, the past generations. And it reminds me of something that I once heard, that it takes about 3 generations before a family can fully confront what has happened, to the generation of the grandparents. That you have the generation of the grandparents who just stay quiet and don't want to talk about it. Then you have the next generation who might ask a few questions, but they respect that silence and don't want to prod or pry too much. And then you have the third generation who really can look across and say, wait a minute, there's just a lot here that was never spoken. And now I'm the product of that silence. And it's resonating with what you're saying.
No, I agree. And that's kind of a sort of TV and storytelling kind of, I don't want to say trope because that makes it sound, common, but yeah, the generational saga. The immigrant family comes over, tries to sort of put down roots, tries to forget about where they came from, because as far as they're concerned, they're looking forwards, not backwards. They want their children to be raised in this sort of new, sort of more affluent environment that they've sort of worked so hard and sacrificed so much to move to. And so the children sort of, I don't know, they're the first born there. So they are preoccupied with assimilating as much as possible. And, that history is very much alive in my family. And I see the way my parents are. They don't speak a word of Jamaican patois ever. Like they don't, my grandparents, you even look at their gardens, for example, the difference between their gardens. Both sets of grandparents grew herbs and fruit, etc. in their gardens. Their gardens were about growing and feeding their family. Whereas my parents, just like, okay, well, is it neat and tidy? Are we going to get cussed out by the neighbors for it? And that's all they care about. Whereas my generation, we're like, oh, wait, but like, okay, so we were born here and you were born here, but like our grandparents are from there and we want to know why they weren't talking about that. My grandparents were always very circumspect about their lives in Jamaica. All 4 of them came from Jamaica. I only knew 3 of them. 2 of them are, only one of them is now still alive. Sorry, you want to?
Yeah, no, I wanted to, I want to please finish that thought, but it's bringing to mind the way that the book opens, which is with Norman's section here, and your very deliberate use of patois. And I wondered, I want you to continue your thought, but after that, I'd love for you to read a part from that beginning, and then let's continue to talk about this, because I think I'm fascinated with some of the choices you made with language here.
Yeah, so I was saying that I only knew 3 of my grandparents, and only one of them is still alive. She's in a care home. But Norman is actually based on her husband. So my paternal grandfather, who they came to the UK in the 50s. He died when my dad was 2 years old. So my dad knows nothing about him. Nobody talks about him. He's just someone whose story has pretty much vanished off the face of the earth. But all I've been allowed to know about him was that and so I don't even know if this is a myth or not, but I've written a fiction about it anyway. That he was fit and healthy when he came to the UK. But as soon as he arrived, or pretty much as soon as he arrived, he started to suffer migraine headaches and sight loss, to the point that he couldn't work anymore. He went to a doctor. The doctor dismissed him, saying, because he was 6'4", or 2 meters tall almost. And the doctor's like, well, you're so tall. You're closer to the sun than the rest of us, and the sun's very different here than it is down there in the tropics. That's what I've been told, that my grandfather was told about his blindness. And apparently he was sent back to live in Jamaica because my grandmother, who wanted to stay here, had their 2 children, couldn't afford to work and raise the 2 children and care for him. So he was sent back to live with family, and he died. So I was thinking very much about the Windrush generation when the Windrush scandal broke in December 2017. Briefly, for anyone who doesn't know, the government were illegally deporting Caribbean immigrants who'd often lived and worked in this country for most of their lives, often come on their parents' visas when they were children. And the landing cards were burned or destroyed back in 2010. And then in 2014, the government asked them to prove that they could legally stay and had been here the whole time. So, people died because they couldn't get benefits anymore. They couldn't work. They couldn't sort of claim social housing. They were deported. They were attacked in Jamaica or wherever else they come from. And that's my grandparents' generation and their children's generation. So it got me really thinking about them. And so I was able to sort of rehabilitate that story. And I'll just read then a little bit from the opening of the novel. And I've not rehearsed, so excuse if there's any Jamaican listeners. Excuse my terrible excuse of patois. So this is July 20th, 1959. This the best summer since we come to England 3 years ago. It hot, not hot like Jamaica, but I don't feel a cloud past the sun today. And no rain has fallen for a long time now. I stand on my front lawn and breathe. The bush are strong with plenty of fragrant rose. My son Robert loved to tot around with the watering can that almost as big as him. I can hear how much water he is pouring on each root. I don't know how he can't feel the cold water dribbling on his foot. Strong little man. He's going to be tall. Already he's quite up to me knee. Glory want to help, but she's too small. And I have to listen for her all the time in case I trip upon her or she scratch herself on the thorn. Not too much, son, I said to Robert when I can hear the water start to puddle. Move to the next one. Hello, little man. Am you helping your dad water the garden? Mr. Pierce, my neighbor, made me jump as he walked up in path. Say hello to Mr. Pierce, Robert. Hello, he say all quiet. I say, good afternoon, Mr. Pierce. How are you today? Knowing he will just go on and on about his ailment. I ain't too bad, Same old aches and pains. My arthritis has been playing me up somewhat rotten, but I can't complain. Ethel ain't well herself with her legs. Can't wait till your lad's big enough to run down the shops for we. Anyway, it's a bit hot for me in this heat. It's all right for you coming from the West Indies. Not really, I say. My body used to the cold now. I have hardly any sight left, but I know Mr. Pierce never leave his door without his flat cap, old work coat and boot, though he must have retired from the gaswork 10 years ago.
Thank you so much, Paul. That was wonderful. I think I can hear part of your theater background in that. That's fantastic. What struck me about that section was, of course, the Jamaican patois, but also the way that, for example, Norman's neighbor is heard. And in that voice, you hear another world in that accent. This is a story about class. And if there's anything that I've learned about the UK, of course, also in the US, is that people can often tell where you're from or what position you are just by listening to you. And so I thought that there was something very interesting happening in that interplay between this Jamaican patois and then this neighbor's voice also
Yeah.
coming in.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I wanted to, I mean, certainly because Norman's blind as well, everything that he hears will be super important. So, you know, the way he speaks is very different from the way his neighbor speaks, of course. And I wanted to honor Norman's language and sort of use of language, but also the Black Country dialect where I'm from. They're very, 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 very precious about that. You know, it's very close to Birmingham and the Brummie accent. But if you spoke to a Black Country person and said, "Oh yeah, I've got a Brummie accent," you'd get slapped. So, so yeah, I wanted to honor the Black Country accent, and it's not standard English. It's not. I mean, you can't render the way Mr. Pierce speaks in standard English and hope to get the same experience. And also, there's going to be people from the Black Country, I hope, reading the book. So I wanted them to hear their voice and their way of speaking in the book, because you never get that in literature. So you know, there are many sort of examples of books that I've read which use phonetically rendered dialect, such as, you know, works by Toni Morrison, for example. You know, if we're speaking about the American context. But in, you know, in terms of Jamaican patois, certainly Marlon James, Andrea Levy, you know, gave me permission. So when I was creating the character of Norman, I actually did a bit of an acting job on him. So I kind of spent a lot of time sort of thinking about his physicality. I'd done some acting. I'd recently played Othello, and just kind of went through the sort of process of creating that character physically. So I was sort of fresh from doing that and kind of thought, well, I could do the same for Norman. And cut a long story short, I sat down in my room one day. I was living in Brixton down in South London. And I rolled a joint, if I can say that live on camera.
You can now, it's legal in New York.
Brilliant. I rolled a joint and I sat and smoked, and I recorded myself on my phone, and I just sort of went off on this monologue in Jamaican patois as Norman, sort of talking about the way I've been treated and what I've experienced and what I want for my children and how scared I am. You know, I'd gone around my house. I was living with a family with a 2-year-old child whose toys and clothes were strewn all around the house. And I put a blindfold on myself. I'd lived in that house for 5 years, but once I put a blindfold on, I could have been anywhere. And I was tripping up on the stairs. And I kind of thought, well, if I'm a 6'4" massive guy with 2 little toddlers running around my feet and I'm blind, I'm going to be really scared of trampling on them. So you become extremely vulnerable. You know, your size then becomes a massive handicap. So yeah, I sort of physically sort of accessed Norman's character, and yeah, the monologue that I recorded that day, I transcribed it and it became the first draft.
Wow, that's fantastic. I wish that there was a recording of that monologue. I would love to hear that.
There is. It's in my phone.
All right. Please send it to me after this, please.
Okay.
You know, Jesse, who is, I think I could say the central character in your novel, is raised a Jehovah's Witness, and he struggles with his sexuality. In some ways, he's fragmented. He's trying to live in several worlds at once until at some point it comes to a head, particularly in a scene with Fraser and what happens afterwards. And he has to leave home, and he goes to live in London. And this is where I know that when he's there, he's exploring his sexuality, but also what it seemed to me is that he's testing himself, testing his ease in his own body, you know, pushing himself to see how far he can go. There are scenes that you wrote when he's a sex worker that carry intense or immense tenderness, but also real honesty in the portrayal of sex. And I wonder if you could read a small part of, there's one scene with Thurston that I'm thinking about. I'd like the audience to hear how you balance the writing of sex with the emotional undercurrents that exist in a moment. And then I'd love to hear you talk about this moment.
Sure. This would probably be about a sort of 5-minute read then, if that's okay for you.
It's fine with me.
Okay. And I should say this is adult material. Thurston tried to suck Jesse's dick the way Jesse had sucked his, but couldn't deal with Jesse's extra length and girth and repeatedly gagged. Soon he came back up to the bedhead, out of breath, blushing and with a wet pink mouth, and rolled Jesse round on top of him. Jesse crept his fingers lightly over the contours of Thurston's collarbone, neck, and shoulders and nibbled his nipples, which stood up prominently. There wasn't a hair on his body until a fine, almost adolescent trail from just beneath his navel that spread to his trimmed pubes. As Thurston's dick pulsed in his mouth, Jesse began to worry he might come too quickly, so he lifted Thurston's legs over his shoulders to draw him more comfortably to the middle of the bed and spread him open. He felt fresh guilt and ecstasy to observe such a man from that angle, where it had become boring and commonplace with more obvious, sluttier men. The underside of his tongue was still sore from the last guy. Jesse came up for a moment and stared in, making the little fine hairs tremble with his breath. Thurston opened his eyes. The trust with which he was looking up at Jesse from his pillow aroused him all the more, and he felt the notice of an orgasm pass through his body. This was the best part of his new life. He lifted himself up, anchored his feet in the bed, and pushed himself inside. "Please, lube," Thurston said, wincing as he stiffened and pushed Jesse out with his hands. "Sorry," said Jesse, curling his tongue under and consoling the nip of rawness. He reached over to the bedside table and squirted some liquid silk onto his palm. "Condom?" Thurston's elbows were locked open, keeping Jesse out. So Jesse reached for the packet of condoms on the side table, taking care not to spill the lube from his palm, but Thurston freed his legs and pulled himself up to sitting. "Sorry," Jesse said, as Thurston dragged down one of the 2 small hand towels folded over the brass bedhead and gave it to Jesse to wipe his hands with, using the other to dab the droplets of sweat on his forehead and neck. "It's okay, you were in the moment," Thurston said as he used his towel to dry his slick ass. Then, in a mildly chastising tone, "You did say you practice safe sex." "I do usually," Jesse said, unable now to make eye contact. "How many times have you had unprotected sex?" Jesse dried his hand of all the sticky lube and sat on his feet watching his dick go down. He ogled the drinks on the bedside table. "Help yourself to whatever you want," said Thurston. Jesse took down the bottle of Coca-Cola. He didn't know how thirsty he was until he drank half of it in one go. He drank it so quickly the fizziness burned his throat. Some of it dribbled down his face and belly and onto the bed cover. "Sorry," he said, rubbing it into the towel. "Don't worry," said Thurston, now sitting up against the bedhead, with one leg bent and the other hanging over the edge of the mattress. His dick had retreated back within his thick foreskin, relaxed against the pink drape of his scrotum. His eyes searched Jesse. "Do your clients make you fuck them without a condom?" Jesse glanced at Thurston's face just to see if he might be judging. He saw concern. "Have any of your clients ever fucked you without a condom?" Jesse looked over his shoulder as if he wanted to leave the room. "You're a beautiful boy, and you have your whole life ahead of you. Have you been safe?" "Not always," said Jesse quietly. He drank another 3 gulps of Coca-Cola, which again burned his throat. Have you been tested? Asked Thurston. Jesse shook his head tightly, as if his neck was seized in lime scale, and looked down at his dick, twitching up again as all the men and all the ways went through his mind. Do you know where to go? Jesse, again, shook his head. I've never read that out loud before, apart from when I recorded the audiobook.
Oh, wow.
So
Thank
filthy.
you. It is absolutely this moment of such tenderness, though, the way that that in that first question that Thurston asks, everything seems to pivot. And you leave that scene, or I left that scene thinking this is the moment where Jesse may never be the same again. And I wondered how did you balance writing that honest sexual encounter with those emotional, tender undercurrents still in there? I'm wondering how that scene came about.
I think at heart, Jesse wants to be loved more than anything else. That is the thing that he's missed out on all his life, is unconditional love. And so he may have gone all guns blazing into this sort of bravado world of sex work, testing himself, as you said earlier, pushing himself to see how far he can go, pushing himself to burst free from the doctrine that he'd been raised with all his life. This is the way that he thinks that he can do that. So there's always a balancing act for Jesse in terms of, okay, I don't actually care about myself, but I want to be loved. And one of those things is going to win eventually. And as readers, when we're reading what Jesse's going through at this point, we worry that it's not going to end well for him. You know, this is 2002, so I'm not sure what the healthcare system in the US was doing for gay men then, but in the UK, post-exposure prophylaxis, first of all, wasn't yet under trial even. Pre-exposure prophylaxis was much later, of course. So there wasn't any protection really. And certainly for someone like Jesse, who is coming from a very, very sheltered upbringing, and all of a sudden sort of feels like he's free to express himself sexually with, you know, he's moved away from his family, he's moved to a new city, he doesn't know anybody, nobody knows him, nobody can judge him. There's all these men around, all these like hot men, all these gay bars. He can just go into a gay bar and pick up a guy and go home with him and have sex. Like, this is like a big thing for him. And so he really explores that, but he doesn't understand the consequences. So it's really difficult. And I think Thurston, I mean, what I should say about Thurston, he's in his early 50s. He's from the same area as Jesse, but has grown up in a slightly more sort of middle class, sort of bourgeois background, better educated, went to Cambridge University, is a curator. He's a very well-to-do man. So while they're from different classes, they have something in common. And so Thurston does have an affinity with Jesse, and he does want to protect him. He's been the young kid moving to London as well, even though the time and his kind of personal circumstances were very different. And it was just really important for Jesse to sort of land with someone like him. And of course, I don't want to spoil it for anybody, but Thurston also has something else in his possession that is very, very important to Jesse, although he doesn't know it at that time. So yeah, I mean, in terms of just, you know, Jesse wanting to be loved, wanting to find love, wanting to find the sort of love that can replace his family and replace his religion, that's what he's looking for. And if he can't find those things, you worry for him and what his prospects are of surviving.
Good. Thank you so much for that, Paul. I'm worried that I have many more questions, but I also know that we are slowly running out of time. And maybe, yes, if we can have some help fielding the questions, and if there's any time left, I have a page full.
So we do have a couple of questions from our audience. Oh yeah, more coming in. Okay, so this is one that I also had. An anonymous attendee says, where and how did you develop your taste in music? For those of you who haven't read the book, the soundtrack is wonderful, and just kind of how you sort of like method wrote Norman and kind of just got in his headspace. That's something I love to do as a reader. If you're going to mention a musical artist or even a work of art, I try to incorporate that into my reading experience. And it seems like this attendee does too. So did you want to speak about kind of the role of music in the novel, Paul?
Sure. Music was sort of one of the only things that my mother and I had in common, really. So there'd always be great music playing in my house growing up. And music is a really kind of amazing anchor for memory, I think. So there are certain songs that I'll hear playing that will transport me back immediately, and I can feel, taste, smell everything around me, even though it was a really innocuous moment and I don't know why I remember it, but it's just attached to a song that was playing from the radio, for example. So I used that a lot in writing. This is my first novel. I don't have a craft. So, one review said that I bought my bag of tricks, and it's a lot simpler than that. I think it's just I did whatever I could to sort of generate material, or to look inside myself for the story and for storytelling. But after I left home and as I grew older, came out, started to meet new people, that diversified my taste in music as well. So I remember the first time I heard Joy Division, I was with someone I was dating at the time. We were in the countryside at someone's house and they played Joy Division, and I just never heard anything like it. It just sounded so incredible. And it just really reminded me of home. And someone asked me today, what sort of art do you like? And I had to really think about it. And I think this is very true for my experience with Joy Division as well. I love art that challenges me, but also reminds me of something. That has to be, even if I've never seen it before, it has to sort of evoke some kind of familiarity for me, even if it's challenging. There has to be a kind of familiarity there. There has to be almost an access to nostalgia in it, and that's where my interest lies.
I love that. That's so well put, because I know exactly what feeling that is, but it is hard to kind of to speak.
Isn't it?
Right. That's wonderful. Okay, this one is from the owner of Square Books. He says, Maaza, thank you for hosting this, and Paul, thank you for joining us so late at night / early in the morning, and congratulations on Rainbow Milk. And this is something that we've kind of covered, so I don't know if you want to kind of accentuate, put a fine point on it. But he asks, what brought you to writing, and also what books or writers were particularly inspiring or influential in writing Rainbow Milk. And I know we've talked about Marlon James and Andrea Levy, and a lot about the multi-generation, but if you want to kind of expand a little, or I don't know.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll answer quickly, because then I think Maaza should have another couple of questions. I came to writing, I don't know, like as a child, like I was just always sort of writing little sort of stories. The first short story I wrote was when I was 6, and it was a plagiarism of a film I'd seen called The Blob, about this huge, I think you guys call it jello, but we call it jam, strawberry jam blob that sort of grows to this enormous size and sort of terrorizes the town and sort of consumes cars and everything. So I just found this story amazing, and I wrote exactly the same. I gave it to my teacher, and she was just like, "Yeah, good, Paul. Yeah, yeah, carry on. You know, do your thing." But I've always wanted to be a writer, but I didn't ever think that it would be possible. I wasn't surrounded by literature. There were no books in my house that weren't Bible study aids. My parents are not literary people. The libraries in my area growing up were just dusty, empty places that were really, really depressing and full of drug addicts. So it just wasn't an encouraging kind of situation. There are no bookshops even really in the West Midlands. Like you have to go into central Birmingham to go to a bookshop. So it wasn't encouraged. But it was really strange. I met up and had a bit of a reunion with some old school friends about a year ago, or just over a year, just before the pandemic. And one of them said to me, she was in my English class at school, and she said, "Why is it taking you so long to write a novel?" And I was like, "Girl, what are you talking about?" But she was just like, "Yeah, but you could do that when you were 16." I didn't know that. I didn't know that. But she had that faith in me from back then. So, and I've forgotten really what I was like. I've forgotten that I loved writing essays even so much. So it's always been within me. It just took until my UK publisher Charmaine Lovegrove said, "Look, you've got all this material, write a novel." That happened in 2017, and that's basically where I've come from.
I love that. Yeah, well, it was well worth waiting for, at least as a reader. Maaza, do you have a couple more questions? And unfortunately, we've got to kind of wrap it up, let Paul go to bed.
I know. I have.
I'm happy. I'm fine. Like, guys, look, it's my publication day. Like, I've got my fuel and my medicine. I'm good.
This is really a celebration. Well, I have two questions, and let me see if I can connect them into one. Something that you do really well in this book also is really shine a light on what it means to work in this world, what it means to exist, but to work in order to survive. And this is the way the book begins with Norman, and it continues through with Jesse. And he works in a series of jobs in the food industry, and he's also a sex worker. And I was struck by how acutely you were detailing some of the things that he does at work. I think one was making coffee on an espresso machine. Like it is detailed up to its last mundane act. And I set that next to the stark honesty of the sex scenes that you write. And I wondered if there was a connection there. But here's the second part of this, and let me see if there's a way to connect it and then this will be my last question. And I'm wondering if this has something to do about being Black in the historical moment that Jesse lives in, or being Black and British in this world. Something about the body. I had all these thoughts, and I would love to hear your ideas on that.
Well, I think there's a definite connection in terms of the way I write visually and in detail. So for Jesse, all of this is new experience. You move to London, the restaurant that he goes to work in is the poshest restaurant he's ever worked in. Although as Londoners, we probably think, oh, that's just like a sort of like basic brasserie. But for Jesse, it's just like, oh, wow, like there's paintings on the wall. He's worked at McDonald's before. That's his experience. So like he's walking into, this sort of French style brasserie, and he's kind of like, wow, this is like really posh. There's like flowers there and art on the walls and everything. French waitresses polishing glasses, etc. So everything is new experience. Everything is new experience. When it comes to the coffee machine scene that you mentioned, that is a few years later on when he's much more experienced. And I think what I wanted to do with that was just to show how easy it is to make really good coffee and point out like that there's just so much bad coffee out there. Like, why, when it's so easy? I think that's what I wanted to do. But also, you know, more seriously, just to show how difficult that job is. You're a waiter, you know, you're a black waiter as well. So if you're in a bad mood, people are like, oh, you're a moody black person, you know? You get all these racial microaggressions all the time. You know, if you speak well, people are like, oh, where are you from? They'll ask you, where are you from anyway? You know? And it doesn't matter what you say. You can say you're from South London, you can say you're from the Black Country, but what actually they want to get you to say is which former colonial country you come from, so that they can put you in a little box and sort of have this sort of authority over you. And I wanted to show what it's like. You know, there's a million, you know, in researching, I feel like I have to ask permission to write anything because, you know, there are so few kind of precursors. But when researching sort of novels and stories set in restaurants, they were always from a customer's perspective, never from a waiter's perspective. And that's really sad because waiters, you would think, would be excellent narrators for fiction because they have a group of people in their section. It's a constantly changing group, but then the table comes and sits down and you're responsible for them having a good time. You're responsible for them being able to close the deal with their clients. You're responsible for them eating well and not getting poisoned or not eating something that they're allergic to or da 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 da. You're responsible for running hot food from the kitchen. You're responsible for running drinks from the past before the ice is melted. You know, you're in charge of a lot. But then when people question your identity while you're doing that, it's a really difficult job. So I kind of just wanted to show what, yeah, if you like, what the Black body has to go through in those kinds of situations. And that sort of leads me to answer part of a question that came earlier that I forgot in terms of the precursors of Rainbow Milk. You know, there aren't a huge number of Black, queer, British fictions written by men. They just aren't. But I read James Baldwin's Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone when I was 20. Read it, thought it was good, put it down, didn't really sort of understand the significance of Baldwin at that time. No one really did, or he'd sort of been forgotten for a while. And wrote Rainbow Milk years later, then reread Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone last summer, and I could not believe how much of that novel that has survived and found a new life in Rainbow Milk. So there's a scene towards the end of Rainbow Milk where Jesse is moving through the restaurant and all he hears is snatches of conversation from customers asking him for this, that, and the other. Baldwin did exactly the same in Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone. And I couldn't believe it. I thought I was innovating and I couldn't believe that he'd done the same thing. I was like, oh, wow, everyone's going to think I copied him. I did not. It's just a subconscious thing. But it really seeped in, you know, the story of Leo Proudhammer, this young working class Black queer person who becomes embourgeoised, if I can use that word that will probably do red dots under it in Word, by sort of studying acting and sort of becoming part of this sort of gang of method school actors who live in New York lofts, you know. I did exactly the same and sort of became bourgeois by hanging out with white creatives, you know. So that book sort of directed my path and sort of almost wrote my novel for me. And even further back, I've just read a novel called Escape to an Autumn Pavement by a Jamaican novelist called Andrew Salkey. It was released in 1960 and was completely sort of ignored on publication. But again, it's absolutely incredible, this incredible story of a member of the Windrush Generation, a young queer Black man who works in hospitality. is constantly questioning whether he belongs to the Black community and how he can become part of British history. You know, he needs to have this sort of history behind him that white middle class educated men take for granted. You know, how does he get that? How does he stop himself with his education, which is comprehensive? How does he stop himself from being handed a spade? You know, so this is a long tradition that I'm part of, but because we're not sort of taught these things in school, you have to wait until you're much older to find these things out for yourself. And I'm not sure whether that's a good or a bad thing, because I love the discovery, but it would have been nice to know that there were people who came before me. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. That's really lovely. And I think that there will be a new generation that will read about Paul Mendez and read his books in schools and universities. So I really thank you. I really thank you for writing this book. I know that we are out of time. Am I correct?
Yeah, we do start to wrap it up.
Okay.
It's not going to just like cut us off. So
okay, so and we can ask, maybe if there's time, is there time to ask this last question? Or
I can try to answer it very quickly.
Like a lightning
round.
Question.
Let's try to do that. And if we, I'll say thank you at the end, but I'm saying thank you again now, Paul. But go ahead for the last question. Do you want me to, I can read it out loud. It says,
yeah, sorry. So this is our last one from another anonymous attendee. Did you talk much with your living grandparents about writing of the book and talk to them about these feelings for being the third generation, of being in the third generation? I'm sorry.
Not really, no. I mean, as I said earlier, my grandparents were always very circumspect. The grandparent I was closest to passed away in October 2019. And I spent quite a bit of time with her at the end. I helped look after her at the end, which was a great privilege for me. But there were so many things that I couldn't ask and that I couldn't say. And I really regret that now. So moral of the story tonight, guys, is tell your loved ones that you love them before it's too late. But no, we didn't talk really about anything. You know, I've sort of picked up what I picked up over the years, and I did the rest with research. And I'm actually okay with that, because that sort of gave me, you know, I could have written this book as a family history if I'd, you know, had all the information, but it wouldn't have been as interesting. It wouldn't have been a challenge to write. It wouldn't have been a challenge in terms of language and form or any of those things that I've had to rely on to write this novel. So yeah, like Bernardine Evaristo said once, you know, you take a couple of things, a couple of facts, you build the rest with your imagination and with research. And I absolutely stick to that. So
so I do want to kind of buried the lead a little bit. So if we haven't picked up on this already, this was released last year in the UK to great acclaim. It's been shortlisted for quite a few awards. It was also, I think as of like a couple of days ago, an American Booksellers Association Indies Introduce pick. We will have signed book plates. I think, Paul, you signed those maybe last week, and they're on their way to us now. So if you buy a copy with us, we will hold it for you until we get those book plates. It's kind of our COVID workaround for signed first editions. And I would like to remind folks that we can't host wonderful events like this in person, on Zoom, or otherwise without your support. So if you would like to read Rainbow Milk, do hope you'll get it from us. And I thank you both so much for your cool heads under pressure after a bumpy start, such grace and benevolence. And Maaza, for your wonderful questions. I loved the question of kind of the specifics of just kind of labor, of daily kind of labor to live. Because you're right, that's never in books, and it should be. And Paul, you said so many wonderful things, but I think my favorite one was when you mentioned that Jesse has this kind of, is on this precipice of, I don't really care about myself, but I want to be loved. And I think that that's something that all readers have experienced. And, you know, and that's what makes this book so great, because it kind of cracks open the canon, and you are kind of taking your rightful place in literature, writing this beautiful book. But it also just, it's universal in those little moments too. And it's just beautiful. You're all crazy if you don't read it.
Nice.
I'm sorry. I really love this book. But
thank you.
If y'all would, so thank everyone for joining us, and I guess it's time to say goodbye.
Yeah.
Congratulations, Paul.
Thank you so much, Paul.
Thank you.
All right, bye.
Good luck,
Bye, everybody.
congratulations.